3 days before a dog leaves this world, they sometimes start loving you differently. Not louder, not desperately, just differently, in ways most people miss until it's too late. Last winter, a man in Montana woke up at 5:12 in the morning because he felt something pressing gently against his chest. It was his 12-year-old German Shepherd, Atlas, sitting beside the bed in complete silence. That alone wasn't strange. Atlas had slept near him almost every night for over a decade. But this time felt different. The dog wasn't asking to go outside. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't sick. He was just staring at him in the dark with a look so calm, so strangely focused, that the man actually asked out loud, "Buddy, what's wrong?" Atlas slowly lowered his head onto the edge of the mattress and let out a long breath, almost like relief. Then he stayed there without moving for nearly an hour. What the man didn't know was that this would become the first sign. Because dogs do something near the end of their lives that animal behaviorists rarely talk about openly. They begin closing emotional distance. Not with everyone. With you, the person they built their entire world around. And once you understand the behaviors they show during that time, you may realize your own dog has already tried to say goodbye in ways you never understood. Dogs don't think about death the way humans do. They don't sit awake fearing the future. But they do understand change inside their bodies. They understand weakness. They understand energy fading. And most importantly, they understand attachment. Researchers studying canine bonding have found that dogs organize their emotional lives around proximity and safety. Who they sleep near, who they follow, who they check on when something feels wrong. And when a dog senses that their time with you is becoming limited, many of them begin returning constantly to the one place that has always made them feel safe. You. That's why some dogs suddenly start following their owners from room to room again after years of independence. Why they quietly sit outside the bathroom door. Why they stare longer. Why they sleep pressed against your legs even when they haven't done that in years. Owners often think these are random old age behaviors. They're not always random. Sometimes, your dog is trying to stay emotionally close before they let go. And the heartbreaking part is that most people only understand these moments after the house becomes quiet. The next change was so small that Ethan almost laughed at himself for noticing it. Atlas stopped eating until Ethan sat down beside him. For years, the old German Shepherd had eaten the second food touched the bowl. It was routine, automatic. But now, every morning, Atlas would walk over to the kitchen, look at the food, then turn back toward Ethan without taking a single bite. At first, Ethan thought maybe the dog was becoming picky with age. Maybe his stomach was bothering him. He switched brands, added warm water, even bought expensive canned food from a pet store 40 miles away because the cashier said senior dogs loved it. None of it changed anything. Atlas still waited. One morning, after nearly 10 minutes of watching the untouched bowl sit there, Ethan finally walked over and crouched beside him. The moment he did, Atlas lowered his head and quietly began eating. Slow, careful, calm. Ethan smiled a little and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You getting clingy on me, old man?" But what felt sweet on the surface carried a much deeper instinct underneath it. In the wild, dogs and wolves are most vulnerable while eating. Their nervous systems stay alert even during rest, but especially during meals. That is why trust matters so much around food. And older dogs nearing the end of life sometimes begin seeking emotional reassurance during moments that suddenly feel physically uncertain to them. They do not understand illness the way humans explain it, but they feel weakness. They feel change. They feel their body becoming less predictable. So they look for the one thing that still feels stable. Presence. Atlas had started watching Ethan constantly now. Not anxiously, not fearfully, just carefully, as though he was memorizing him. When Ethan moved from the couch to the kitchen, Atlas followed. When Ethan showered, Atlas waited outside the bathroom door with his head resting against the wall. At night, he no longer slept in his usual spot near the fireplace. Instead, he lay directly beside Ethan's side of the bed, close enough that Ethan could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing in the dark. People often misunderstand this stage because the behaviors themselves do not seem dramatic. There is no emergency. No sudden collapse, just small shifts in closeness, small changes in attachment. And because they happen quietly, owners usually explain them away. He is just getting older. He is slowing down. He is being affectionate. But sometimes what looks like affection is actually something far more emotional. A dog trying to stay connected while they still can. One evening, Ethan reached down absent-mindedly to pet Atlas while watching television, and the dog pressed his face into Ethan's hand with a kind of softness he had never felt before. Not excitement, not neediness, just stillness. And for reasons he could not explain, Ethan suddenly felt a knot form in his chest. 2 nights later, Ethan could not sleep. The wind outside rattled softly against the cabin windows while the old clock above the kitchen sink ticked through the silence, 1 second at a time. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, he finally gave up, walked into the kitchen, and poured himself coffee he did not even want. Atlas followed him slowly, his nails tapping gently against the hardwood floor. That was another thing Ethan had started noticing. The dog no longer rushed anywhere. Every movement looked measured now, almost thoughtful. Atlas lowered himself carefully beside the table and watched Ethan with those steady amber eyes that had once looked fearless and unstoppable. Ethan leaned back in the chair and stared at him for a long moment. "You are worrying me," he whispered. Atlas blinked slowly, then rested his head on Ethan's boot. And in that quiet little gesture was something many dog owners never realize until years later. Near the end of life, some dogs stop trying to hide their need for comfort. Younger dogs often mask pain instinctively. Survival wiring teaches animals not to appear vulnerable. But older dogs who deeply trust their person sometimes begin doing the opposite. They seek physical grounding, contact, reassurance. It is why many aging dogs suddenly lean against their owners while standing, why they sleep touching them, why they rest their heads on laps, feet, or hands more than before. Touch becomes emotional regulation, a way to calm a nervous system that no longer feels fully secure inside its own body. Ethan reached down and rubbed the thick fur around Atlas's neck, and for the first time in years, the dog closed his eyes immediately the second Ethan touched him. Not lightly, completely, total surrender. That was what unsettled Ethan most. Atlas had always been alert, always listening for movement outside, always half awake even during rest. But now he seemed tired in a way that felt deeper than physical exhaustion, almost like he was finally letting go of the responsibility of watching over everything. The next morning, Ethan drove into town for groceries, and when he returned 40 minutes later, he found Atlas lying directly in front of the front door waiting for him. Not asleep, waiting. The second Ethan stepped inside, the dog stood up slowly and pressed against his legs so firmly Ethan nearly lost balance. Hey, he laughed softly, though his voice cracked a little. Then something happened that would stay with him forever. Atlas looked up at him with an expression so intensely focused, so quiet and searching, that Ethan instinctively knelt down in front of him. The dog gently touched his nose against Ethan's forehead and stayed there for several seconds without moving. No barking, no excitement, just stillness, connection. And what Ethan did not know then was that behaviorists often describe moments like these as proximity-seeking rituals, small repeated attempts by dogs to reinforce emotional closeness with the people they trust most when they sense change approaching. Dogs may not understand death the way humans do, but love? That part they understand completely. By the end of that week, Ethan had stopped pretending nothing was wrong. Atlas was still eating, still walking outside every morning into the snow-covered yard behind the cabin, still lifting his ears whenever he heard Ethan's truck pull into the driveway. But there was something fading behind his eyes now, something impossible to measure and impossible to ignore once you saw it. One afternoon, Ethan grabbed Atlas's leash for their usual walk down the narrow trail behind the property. For nearly 11 years, the moment that leash moved, Atlas would explode with energy, tail high, pacing circles, barely able to contain himself. But this time, the old German shepherd only stood there quietly, watching Ethan with soft eyes. Ethan knelt beside him immediately. "You do not want to go today?" Atlas slowly wagged his tail once, then walked over anyway, not out of excitement, but because Ethan was going. The air outside was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Snow crunched beneath Ethan's boots while Atlas moved beside him at half his old pace. And then, about half a mile into the trail, the dog stopped completely. Not from exhaustion, not confusion. He just stopped and looked up at the mountains ahead of them. Ethan waited patiently, expecting him to continue. But Atlas stayed there, staring quietly into the distance while the cold wind moved through his fur. Sometimes, near the end of life, dogs begin lingering in places that matter to them. familiar trails, favorite rooms, spots filled with memory and scent. Researchers who study canine cognition believe dogs form emotional associations with locations far more deeply than most people realize. A favorite walking path is not just exercise to a dog. It is routine, safety, shared history. Atlas stood there for nearly a full minute before slowly turning back toward Ethan. Then he walked closer than usual, pressing against Ethan's leg as they continued down the trail together. On the way home, something happened that Ethan would replay in his head for years afterward. Atlas stumbled slightly crossing a patch of uneven snow. It was small, barely noticeable, but Ethan reacted instantly and caught the leash tighter. "Easy," he whispered. The dog looked up at him immediately, and for a second Ethan saw it. Not fear, not pain, apology, as if Atlas somehow felt bad for slowing him down. That is one of the cruelest parts of loving a loyal dog. Even when their bodies begin failing them, many still focus entirely on their person. Their attention stays outward. Their instinct stays connected to you. Back at the cabin, Atlas did something he had not done since he was a puppy. He followed Ethan into the bedroom before sunset and climbed slowly onto the rug beside the bed while Ethan folded laundry. Then the dog rested his chin directly on Ethan's knee and stayed there without moving. No demand, no sound, just quiet contact. And while Ethan absent-mindedly rubbed the gray fur around Atlas's face, a thought entered his mind so suddenly it made his chest tighten. He realized he had started measuring time differently. Not in months, not in years, in moments. That night, Ethan did something he had been avoiding for days. He sat on the floor beside Atlas with his laptop open and searched quietly through article after article about aging dogs. Signs of decline, behavioral changes, emotional attachment near the end of life. He told himself he was only being responsible, only preparing. But deep down, he was searching for someone to tell him he was imagining all of it. Instead, every sentence seemed to confirm the fear growing heavier in his chest. Increased clinginess, changes in sleeping patterns, prolonged eye contact, following behavior, seeking comfort through physical touch. Ethan closed the laptop halfway through because he could not stand reading another word. Atlas was lying beside the couch watching him carefully the entire time. Then, slowly, the old dog stood up and walked over without making a sound. He lowered himself beside Ethan and rested one paw gently across Ethan's arm. That single movement nearly broke him, because Atlas had always done that during the hardest moments of Ethan's life. When Ethan lost his father 8 years earlier, Atlas stayed pressed against him through the entire night. After the divorce, when the house felt unbearably empty, Atlas had followed him from room to room for weeks like he understood silence better than any human ever could. Dogs remember emotional patterns far more than people realize. They may not understand every event, but they absolutely remember your emotional state. Studies on canine cognition show dogs are highly sensitive to changes in human breathing, facial tension, vocal tone, and body posture. Over time, they begin associating certain behaviors with sadness, stress, loneliness, or grief. And many dogs respond by offering quiet physical presence instead of stimulation. They do not always try to distract you. Sometimes they simply stay. Atlas had always stayed. Ethan reached over and placed his hand across the dog's paw, noticing how much thinner it felt than before. The thick, powerful shepherd that once pulled him through hiking trails and snowstorms now seemed fragile beneath his fingertips. But Atlas looked peaceful. That was the strange part. There was no panic in him. No confusion, just a calmness that somehow made Ethan even more emotional. Around midnight, Ethan finally stood up and headed toward the bedroom. Atlas followed slowly behind him like always now. But halfway down the hallway, the dog suddenly stopped near the living room window. Ethan turned back immediately. Atlas. The old shepherd stood there staring out into the darkness beyond the glass. Snow drifted softly outside beneath the porch light, while the woods beyond the cabin disappeared into shadow. Atlas did not bark, did not growl. He simply watched the night quietly for several seconds before turning back toward Ethan again. Some owners describe moments like this near the end of a dog's life. Long pauses, quiet observation, almost reflective behavior. Scientists cannot fully explain whether dogs contemplate memory or mortality in the human sense. But they do know aging dogs often become more withdrawn and emotionally focused as their world grows smaller and more centered around familiar people and places. Ethan waited until Atlas walked toward him again before continuing down the hallway together. And later, lying awake in bed while Atlas slept pressed against the side of the mattress, Ethan realized something painful. The dog was no longer just part of his routine. Atlas had quietly become the measure of home itself. The following morning, Ethan woke to complete silence, and for one terrifying second, he thought Atlas was gone. He sat upright. Instantly, heart pounding hard enough to make his chest ache. The space beside the bed was empty. "Atlas," he called, his voice rough with panic. Then he heard the faint sound of claws against wood somewhere down the hallway. Ethan moved quickly through the cabin and found Atlas standing in the kitchen near the back door. The old shepherd was not asking to go outside. He was simply standing there staring toward the snow-covered yard beyond the glass. Ethan exhaled shakily and walked over beside him. "You scared me." Atlas glanced up briefly before looking back outside again. There was something unusually peaceful about him that morning. Not energetic, not weak, just calm in a way Ethan could not explain. After a few seconds, Ethan opened the back door and cold winter air poured into the kitchen. Atlas stepped outside slowly. The snow reached almost halfway up his legs now, and Ethan stayed close behind while the old dog wandered quietly through the yard. But instead of moving toward the trees or the trail like usual, Atlas began stopping at certain places around the property. First near the old woodpile beside the fence. Then near the porch steps where he used to wait for Ethan every evening after work. Then beside the rusted truck parked near the barn. At each spot, he paused for several seconds before moving on. Ethan watched him carefully, confused by the behavior, but unable to look away. Dogs experience the world through scent and emotional association in ways humans can barely imagine. A location to us is visual. To a dog, it is layered with memory. Smells from years ago, emotional states, familiar routines, the scent of the people they love. Researchers studying canine memory believe dogs form extremely powerful environmental associations connected to comfort and attachment. And older dogs nearing the end of life sometimes revisit emotionally significant places with unusual focus, almost like retracing the shape of their world one last time. Atlas eventually stopped near the edge of the property where the pine trees opened toward the frozen field beyond the cabin. Snow drifted softly around him while the morning sun reflected pale gold across the ice. Ethan stood a few feet away, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, suddenly overwhelmed by a feeling he did not want to name. Atlas turned slowly and looked directly at him. And then the old shepherd did something he had not done in years. His tail wagged the exact same way it used to when he was younger. Slow at first, then fuller, happier. For just a moment, Ethan could see the dog he remembered from a decade earlier. The powerful young shepherd who ran through rivers, chased snowflakes, and slept beside campfires after long hikes through the mountains. Ethan smiled despite the pressure building in his throat. "There you are," he whispered softly. Atlas walked toward him immediately after that and leaned his full weight gently against Ethan's legs. Ethan wrapped both arms around the thick fur along the dog's neck and closed his eyes. And standing there in the freezing Montana morning, surrounded by silence and snow, Ethan realized something heartbreaking. Sometimes dogs do not pull away near the end. Sometimes they come closer than ever. That evening, the storm rolled in hard across the mountains. Wind pushed against the cabin walls while snow swirled outside thick enough to erase the tree line completely. Ethan built a fire in the stone fireplace and laid an extra blanket near the couch for Atlas, but the old shepherd ignored it. Instead, he stayed close beside Ethan every second, moving slowly from room to room as though separation itself had become uncomfortable for him now. Around 8 o'clock that night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table sorting through old photographs he had pulled from a box in the closet earlier that afternoon. Atlas rested beside his chair while Ethan flipped through years of memories one picture at a time. There was Atlas as a puppy with paws too big for his body. Atlas covered in mud after falling into a river during a camping trip. Atlas sleeping in the passenger seat of Ethan's truck with his head against the window during long drives through Wyoming and Idaho. And then there was the photo Ethan stopped on longest. It showed him sitting alone outside the cabin years earlier during the worst winter after his divorce. He remembered that night clearly. He had sat outside for nearly an hour, unable to stop thinking about everything he had lost. And in the picture, Atlas was there beside him, pressed shoulder to shoulder against his coat, while snow collected slowly across both of them. Ethan stared at the photo until his vision blurred slightly. Then he felt movement beside him. Atlas had stood up. Slowly, carefully, the old shepherd placed both front paws gently against Ethan's leg and rested his head on Ethan's chest. Ethan wrapped his arms around him automatically. "I know," he whispered, though he did not even know what he meant by it anymore. Sometimes the deepest thing a dog gives you is not protection or obedience. It is presence during the moments nobody else stayed. Studies on human-animal attachment have found that dogs often become emotional anchors during periods of grief, depression, trauma, and isolation. Their routines regulate us. Their companionship stabilizes stress hormones. Their quiet affection reduces loneliness in ways people often underestimate until the bond is gone. And that is why losing a dog feels so uniquely painful, because they are woven into the emotional structure of everyday life itself. Later that night, Ethan fell asleep on the couch with the television still glowing softly across the dark room. At some point after midnight, he woke up feeling warmth against his side. Atlas had somehow climbed partially onto the couch despite his age and was curled tightly against Ethan's chest exactly the way he used to sleep as a puppy years ago. Ethan stayed perfectly still, almost afraid to move. The old shepherd's breathing was slow and uneven but peaceful. Ethan gently rested one hand along the side of Atlas's face, feeling the gray fur beneath his fingertips. And then something happened that shattered him quietly from the inside. Atlas opened his eyes and looked directly at him with complete calmness. No fear, no confusion, just trust, pure trust. The kind built over thousands of ordinary days lived together. Ethan felt tears burn behind his eyes before he could stop them. "You do not have to worry about me," he whispered softly into the darkness. Atlas blinked once, slowly, and pressed closer against him. And for the first time since all of this began, Ethan finally understood what the dog had been trying to say through every stare, every touch, every silent moment beside him. Atlas was not asking Ethan to save him. He was trying to make sure Ethan would remember he was loved after he was gone. The next morning arrived strangely warm for late January. Sunlight poured through the cabin windows, melting thin layers of snow from the roof, while the forest outside dripped softly beneath the sound of distant crows. Ethan woke up before dawn without knowing why. For a few seconds, he simply lay there listening. Then he noticed something unusual. Atlas was not beside the bed. Panic hit him instantly again, sharper this time. Ethan stood up so quickly the blankets fell to the floor. "Atlas." His voice echoed through the quiet cabin. No sound answered back. Ethan moved through the hallway with his heartbeat pounding harder with every step until he finally saw him. Atlas was lying near the front door, facing the sunrise, spilling faint orange light across the floorboards. The old shepherd looked peaceful, completely still except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Ethan knelt beside him immediately. "Hey," he whispered softly. Atlas turned his head at the sound of Ethan's voice, and the moment their eyes met, Ethan felt something shift deep inside him. There was no fear left anymore. Somehow, impossibly, the dog looked almost relieved. Ethan sat beside him on the floor for a long time without speaking. One hand rested gently along Atlas's ribs while morning light slowly filled the cabin around them. And then Atlas began doing something Ethan had not noticed before. The old dog kept looking back and forth between Ethan and the front door. Not anxiously, not repeatedly, just calmly, almost thoughtfully. Behaviorists sometimes observe this in deeply bonded dogs near the end of life. A quiet orientation toward both their person and the outside world at the same time, as though part of them is still anchored in attachment while another part is beginning to let go. Dogs do not understand death philosophically, but they do understand transition, separation, change, and many seem to seek emotional closeness during those moments rather than isolation. Ethan eventually opened the front door and cold mountain air drifted gently inside. Atlas lifted his nose slightly, breathing in the scent of pine, snow, wood smoke, and the familiar wilderness surrounding the cabin he had known almost his entire life. Ethan sat beside him wrapped in silence while the morning breeze moved softly through the old dog's fur. After several minutes, Atlas slowly leaned against Ethan one more time. Not heavily this time. Lightly, almost delicate. Ethan closed his eyes and rested his forehead against the side of Atlas's head. "You were a good boy," he whispered, his voice breaking completely now. The best, actually. Atlas stayed pressed against him quietly, and in that moment Ethan understood something most people only realize too late. Dogs spend their entire lives studying us, memorizing us, learning our routines, moods, fears, and comforts. And when they sense their time growing short, many of them stop caring about toys, excitement, or even food the way they once did. What they want most is proximity, your voice, your scent, your presence. Not because they are afraid for themselves, but because your existence became the emotional center of theirs. Atlas slowly lifted his eyes toward Ethan one final time that morning with the same calm expression he had worn for days now. And Ethan finally stopped trying to hold back the truth he had been fighting since the beginning. The dog was saying goodbye the only way he knew how, by staying close until the very end. Atlas passed away 2 days later, just before sunrise, while Ethan sat beside him on the living room floor. There was no chaos, no dramatic moment, just silence, warmth, and Ethan's hand resting gently against the old shepherd's chest as the breathing slowly faded into stillness. Snow drifted softly outside the cabin windows while the fire cracked low in the fireplace behind them. Ethan stayed there for a long time afterward without moving, one hand still buried in Atlas's fur, almost like some part of him believed the dog might wake up again if he waited long enough. But deep down, he already knew. He had known since the moment Atlas started following him everywhere again, since the long stairs, since the quiet paw on his arm, since the mornings by the door watching the sunrise together. The signs had been there all along, and suddenly every single one of them made sense. Over the following weeks, Ethan noticed something strange about grief. It was not always loud. Sometimes it appeared in tiny moments that shattered him without warning. Reaching for the leash hanging beside the door before remembering. Hearing the floor creak at night and instinctively expecting nails against hardwood. Waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning and turning toward the empty space beside the bed. The silence inside the cabin felt different now. Not peaceful. Missing. Researchers studying the bond between humans and dogs have found that losing a deeply attached dog can trigger grief responses nearly identical to losing a close family member. Because for many people, that is exactly what the dog became. Not a pet, not an animal living in the house. A constant emotional presence woven into the rhythm of everyday life. And perhaps that is why dogs affect us so deeply. They witness the version of us nobody else fully sees. The exhausted version. The grieving version. The lonely version sitting awake long after midnight wondering how to keep going. And somehow they stay beside us through all of it without asking for explanations. A month after Atlas passed, Ethan found himself standing outside near the edge of the property where they used to walk together every morning. Winter had started fading. Patches of grass pushed through the melting snow while sunlight stretched across the frozen field beyond the trees. Ethan stood there quietly with his hands in his coat pockets, staring at the exact place where Atlas had stopped and looked out across the mountains that final week. And for the first time since losing him, Ethan smiled instead of breaking apart. Because he finally understood something the dog had spent years teaching him without words. Love is not measured by how long someone stays. It is measured by how deeply they become part of who you are. While they are here, dogs know this instinctively. They do not waste time pretending affection should be hidden. They stay close when you are hurting. They forgive quickly. They love completely. And near the end, many of them seem to spend their final